Working Cows Podcast, episode 240.
Welcome to the podcast that gives producers a platform to discuss and share paradigm-challenging practices. Practices that have increased the effectiveness of their operation and the joy that their families have received from this lifestyle.
Howdy, everybody. This is Clay Connery, host of the Working Cows Podcast, powered by the Global Ag Network, and this episode is brought to you by Grasshopper Mowers. With Grasshopper Mowers, nothing gets in the way of mow day.
It doesn't matter whether you're on the backfield or the front yard. On mow day, perfection is a game of inches. It's a battle of fence line and fierce terrain. Out there, on that Grasshopper mower, you don't let anything stop your stripes. Nothing stands in the way of a job well done. For more on mow day and Grasshopper mowers, visit grasshoppermower.com.
Very excited to share with you today an interview I did with Curt and Darren Nelson. Curt is a farmer from eastern South Dakota, near Brookings, South Dakota, a little bit southeast of Brookings, and Darren got in touch with me after hearing some of the Stoneville Stories episodes that I've been doing and asked me to come and sit down with his grandpa and talk to him, and just had a really neat opportunity to sit down and capture some of his experiences, and Darren sat in with us and helped guide the conversation a little bit, and I really appreciate that. It was a real privilege to get to travel over there and chat with them for a little bit about these things. And just a really unique perspective. I mean, he's gone from horse-drawn agriculture to self-driving tractors. He's seen that transition in his lifetime, so it's a pretty fun conversation, and I'm excited to share it with you right now. Curt, it's a pleasure to meet you. Thank you for agreeing to do this. I really appreciate it.
Okay.
I guess where I'd like to start is, how did your family come to be connected to this land, or did you grow up farming and all that as a kid?
Well, my folks moved here in 1913, and my dad emigrated from Daneland, and so this was their first endeavor after they were married. I've been on this same farm for 74 years.
Okay.
I was born and raised here.
And they were, this is where they came, when they came from Daneland? Or?
Yes.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
And you said that was in 1913?
It was.
Yep. And what brought them here specifically? Do you know why they came here?
I guess they were looking for land and looking for the price, and of course land in South Dakota at that time was cheaper than it was in Iowa, for they first came to Iowa.
Sure.
That's where my mother was born, was in Iowa.
Okay. And was her family multiple generations in Iowa, or?
She had several sisters and a couple of brothers.
Gotcha. Yep. And so, you were born here? Is that right?
Right.
Right. And what are some of your early memories about how things were done on the farm?
My dad always had hired help. It seemed like one or two, and we did the whole 9 yards. As far as we had milk cows, we had cows that just raised calves. And we had pigs and sheep and chickens. So that was kind of what all people had in this part of the world, was considerable variety of livestock. My dad always said if the pigs didn't make money, well, maybe the cattle would. And so that was part of the reason for having some of each.
Was it a homestead? Did they homestead this place, or was it already in operation?
I don't think they homesteaded it. It's just turned to be 100 years old about 2 years ago.
Okay. Not all of that was in your family? Your family hasn't owned it for that whole 100 years? Or
Yes, they have.
Oh, they have. Okay.
Yeah.
Gotcha. Wow. That's very cool. Do you remember the kind of the scale back then? Was it a smaller scale and more diversified? Like you said, the cows and the sheep and cows and the pigs and the chickens and all those things? Or
Oh, yeah. There wasn't such a thing as tractors at that time.
right.
And my dad loved horses. And he just loved to trade horses or buy and sell horses. And he actually, at that time, owned a stud horse that he traveled the neighborhood to people that wanted their mares bred. And then later on, he ended up for 3 different stud horses, different breeding kind of. And so if somebody wanted a roan horse to breed their mares or a sorrel or whatever, why, they had their choices.
Sure. So they weren't necessarily draft horses, or were they?
Yes, they were.
They were draft horses.
Yeah.
Okay. I don't think I've ever seen a roan draft horse that I know of. That's interesting. I guess they're like every other horse. Probably they come in all colors, but most of the draft horses I've seen, I just don't think I've seen a roan one in all the ones I've seen, I guess. But yeah, so it was all done. The work was all done by horse. Do you remember working the fields by horse then?
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I remember when I was 7 years old, my dad put me on a 1-row corn cultivator pulled by a team of horses, and it was right close to the building spot here, and told me to go ahead and learn how to cultivate. And when I was cultivating that day, I had a shower of rain come up when I was about halfway across the field. So I turned around and headed back to the buildings because I didn't want to get wet. And I really caught it from my dad when he learned that I turned around in the middle of the field because the horses would have stomped on some rows of corn and destroyed them.
Sure.
So I learned a lesson there.
Yeah. And did you say, destroyed the corn? That's what you said, right? Yeah, I see. And so can you kind of walk me through that process of working fields by horses? Is it similar to the way it's done now, working the fields? It's just at a slower pace or less rows per pass, or has it changed some?
Oh, much slower.
Yeah.
I mean, we didn't have, I don't know whether we had more than a quarter of a ground to work with for crops, you know. I don't ever remember having more than the 1/4. But as time went on, my dad bought more land or rented more land. And at the end of the horse, we had 3 2-row cultivators pulled by horses. I remember that, with the rest of the guys all pitched in and helped. And the other thing was, if you covered up a hill of corn by whatever reason, why, you had to stop and walk back and brush the corn or the dirt off the corn, so you still survived the corn.
Huh. So you were talking about having a quarter of ground, and was there some pasture in that quarter and some crops in that quarter, or was it all crops?
It was all crop, but one little piece that we had to have grass, a pasture for milk cows. And at that time, when I was a teenager, I milked 17 cows by hand. And then eventually Dad bought a milking machine, but after milking cows by hand and one thing and another, I decided when I was on my own that I wasn't going to milk cows.
I don't think you're alone in that. Many people that grow up milking cows don't continue after that, especially not hand milking. So then, was all the corn that you raised going into the cows, or in the pigs and the chickens, or was it some of it raised to sell, or how was?
I don't think we had very much to sell. We not only raised corn, but we had oats and barley and wheat. And I don't know whether we always had the same amount each time, but the variety changed from time to time.
And was it a rotation then?
Yeah, it was a rotation.
Gotcha. So maybe a 40 of each, or it might have been different years, different parts were planted. I see.
Different.
And then those, the oats and the barley and the wheat, all of that going into the animals here, or some of it being sold?
Some of it was being sold. I think some of the wheat was sold, and I don't know if there was any corn to be sold. Don't remember that part, but oats. Some oats were sold. The biggest thing was when I was before I was even a teenager. I remember hauling oats to town, but it was generally such a light test weight that it wasn't worth a lot of money because of all the dry years we had. The dry years were in the 30s. In 31 to 33, we had terrible dry years and dust storms that you wouldn't believe.
Yeah. We've gotten a taste of that. Nothing like them. We've got some grass that's holding some things in place, but I've seen more dust blow this last summer than I'd ever seen in my life. So
I remember my dad and my brother. My brother was 11 years older than I was. I was the runt of the family, and I suppose I was about 6 years old. They had a terrible dust storm that day, and my mother was worried about because my dad and brother were out disking in a cornfield with horses. They each had a disc and some horses. I don't remember at that time how many horses they had to pull it with. There was probably 4 horses for each disc.
Oh.
But anyhow, the sky turned black and the wind was ferocious. And she said, let's go out by the ends of the trees. We had trees all around this building spot, kind of like we have now. And so we went out where the gate was to go to the field. And it was just such a terrible wind, but we couldn't see anything and we couldn't hardly know where we were going. But all of a sudden we heard some noises. And it was my dad and brother coming with their teams through the gate. And they said that they just let the horses have their go where they wanted to go, and they found their way through the gates.
Yep.
But that was a terrible, terrible black day.
Wow. Yeah, that's amazing. So they were disking. How many discs behind each or those 4 horses? Do you know? Do you remember?
No, I don't know. They're probably 10 foot.
Okay, gotcha. And wow, so the wheat was being sold, the oats and the barley and the corn probably going back into the cattle. And
for the pigs. A lot of times for the pigs.
Yep. And so then, were you guys selling milk and pork, or what else were you selling?
Well, we were selling milk in town, in Brookings. A lot of times there was a 10-gallon cream can. We separated the milk. Had a cream separator, they called it, in the basement. Mm-hmm. And after milk cows were milked, they carried the milk from the barn to the basement of the house, dumped it in that cream separator and turned that. And then the cream we put in a different can, and the milk in a different can. And when we went to town on Saturday night, which was the night to go to town, I put a can of cream or milk, either one or both, in the trunk of the car and go away to the town, and I sold that. And also, it took a crate of eggs or a basket of eggs or whatever, and took them along to town on Saturday night. The eggs were supposedly or hopefully bought the groceries that we needed for the coming week, and along with the cream check and the milk check.
So you would pick up a cream check and a milk check on Saturday for the previous week, or how did that work?
Yeah, for the previous week.
Gotcha. What you hauled in last Saturday. And was there somebody there to receive the cream and hand out the checks then?
Yep. Yeah.
Gotcha. And so the cream produced by 17 cows and the eggs was basically what your family was living on. Is that right?
That's right.
Yeah, we've come a ways from that. I think it takes a lot more ground and head of livestock than that for a family to get by these days. Would you agree with that?
Yes.
Yeah. What's brought that change on? Do you know, or do you have any perspective on that?
Well, I guess people, time they got a little money in their pocket, why they spend it on things to increase their livelihood.
Sure. So we're living a little bit fancier now than you were then.
Absolutely.
No question about it.
No question about it.
Yeah. Is this house here in the yard the one that you grew up in, or?
Basically, I was born like in 28. That house was built in 26.
Okay.
My uncle built the house so that was a big improvement over what we had.
Sure. And you mentioned an older brother. How many siblings did you have?
Had 2 older sisters, plus my brother.
Okay, just 4 of you then.
Yep.
And your dad had hired men, quite a few of them, or?
Well, maybe 1, 2 at a time or whatever. But they stayed lived right in the house with the family.
That's what I was going to ask, if they lived. And then, so the neighborhood. Can you tell me about the neighborhood? The people, was there kind of a farm on every quarter and real similar operations where they had some milk cows and some pigs and chickens and?
Pretty similar deal. We had people that lived right across the road to the south here. They didn't have children of their own, but they always remember him telling that he had a Model T Ford, and he said it didn't make any difference when they went to town whether they took the team or took the Model T Ford. It was 5 miles an hour either way.
And how far are you guys from Brookings?
We're about 9 miles.
Okay. Couple-hour trip to town then.
Yeah.
And you said that the cream can went in the trunk of the car. What was the car that you were taking to town back then?
Well, at that time it was a Chevrolet. I don't remember anything more about it. It was, of course, an older car.
Yeah. It had 4 doors and a trunk then?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So I was wondering if it was what vintage it was, but I don't know that I've ever seen a car that you could fit a cream can that had to stand up, I would imagine, right?
Oh, yes.
So it's a different kind of car than we have today, where you couldn't even hardly lay a cream can down in some of the trunks I've seen.
Later on, my dad bought a different car, and that was a 1937 Studebaker.
Mm.
And that had a bigger trunk. And my two sisters got to where they were teaching school in the neighborhoods around the country. And in the wintertime, why it was up to my dad or my brother or the hired help to see that they got to the school that they were teaching. And the one that I remember about was about 3 or 4 miles from this place, and so was the other one, about 3 or 4 miles.
Country schools?
Country schools.
Kindergarten through 8th grade.
One room school. And in the wintertime when it was, 20 below or there's snowstorm, blizzard, whatever, they still had to get to school. So my dad would get a team of horses out, or one of the guys, and hook it onto the car because it never would start when it was cold. And there used to be a windmill right in the middle of the yard, and I remember watching out the window, and they'd go round and around the windmill, pulling the car, try to make it start. And a lot of times it wouldn't start, so they just went ahead and with the team of horses, pulled the car to wherever the schools were that the girls were teaching. And the guy that was driving the team would sit on the front fender of the car. By the time he got back home with the team and the car, they were almost froze to death.
Oh, I can't imagine it.
Just a terrible job.
Yeah, like you said, 5 miles an hour, right? I mean, it'd take you a couple hours just to get there and back. One of them. You're talking.
Then they had to go in the afternoon again and bring them home.
Wow, that
went on for several years.
Huh? Yeah, and your sisters were living here while they were teaching school. Then
they were at those closer schools. They eventually were teaching schools in further away, where they stayed with the farm family closer to their school.
Sure. Gotcha. So what was involved in a trip to town on a Saturday night? You talk about going on a Saturday night. Was it later in the evening or pretty early in the afternoon that you would head that direction?
No, I imagine it was 7, 8 o'clock at night at least before we left to go to town.
Huh. Wow. And yeah, so grocery stores and everything were still open, and you could get all your supplies and everything.
Yeah.
Was there a big garden here that you guys took a lot of produce out of and things like that?
My mother had a big garden.
Yep. And kind of potatoes in the basement or in a root cellar somewhere or something like that?
She canned a lot of food.
Yep.
Canned a lot of food.
Yep. And so what was the groceries that you were, or supplies that you were getting on a trip to town? Do you remember?
Well, I don't remember for sure what all came back. It was, of course, some vegetables, and most of the meat that we ate came from our own raising, whether it be a pig or most generally we butchered a pig once a year and had a beef once a year. So that pretty much took care of that part of it.
Sure. And just a dairy steer that you'd butcher?
Yeah, probably.
Yeah. And what breed of cows did you have? Do you remember? Were they Holstein or
Well,
Jersey?
not all. Some were Holstein, but they're kind of a mixture.
Sure.
Mixture, different.
Dairy breeds.
Well, not necessarily all of them, but
okay.
Once in a while there get to be a Hereford that's stuck in there that we milk.
I see. They're the right temperament anyways.
Yeah.
What about putting a dairy bull on them then? Keep a dairy bull around to put on them, or how did...
No, I don't think so.
Okay.
I don't remember what they used for bulls.
Gotcha. Would a neighbor bring one over maybe or something?
No.
No?
No.
So it was a beef.
Beef.
Probably a beef breed then.
Yeah.
I see. Gotcha. Well, there's a lot of people finishing half dairy breeds now and doing a pretty good job of it, I think. So I think that wasn't, had its merits, I think. And so, but the selling the calves, keeping replacements, what were you doing with the calves out of those dairy cows?
Always, my dad always fed them out with grain and then hauled them to market.
Okay. And were they backgrounded? Were they finished?
No, they were finished.
Okay. Wow. And
a lot of times he liked to go to sale barns, and he would buy maybe a young bull that needed castrating, and we did that ourselves. And the same way with pigs. Might be a boar or two he'd bring home because he could buy them a little cheaper, and we'd bring them home and castrate them, and that was a weekly job. Yeah, help do that.
Gotcha. And were there always? He was selling those finished steers into the sale barn or the market. Is that right? Not they weren't going to a butcher or.
Well, generally they went to stockyards in Sioux Falls.
Gotcha.
And some packing house guy bought them in later years, at least.
Right. And were there multiple buyers then? I mean...
Yeah, there generally was 3 or 4 buyers.
And they were buying for packing houses in different places?
Yes.
Not just Sioux Falls?
No, different places.
Yeah. And how far away do you know how far away they might end up? Would they go to Iowa, Wisconsin, Chicago?
Well, Morel's had a plant in Sioux Falls.
Right.
And so that was one of the first places.
Right.
And then there was another plant in Minnesota where some of them went, and in Iowa too in the later years.
Sure. And how were they hauling them to Sioux Falls at that time? Those finished steers, were they like a trailer load at a time, or did they have a...
Well, they didn't know what semis were at them years.
Right.
It was just a little... My dad had a 16-foot truck, 16-foot box that you could put generally about 9 steers on if they were fat. And he was what we call in the trucking business at that time, along with farming. Because at that time, you had to have a permit to haul somebody else's cattle or pigs or sheep or whatever. And so he would haul, whenever one of the neighbors wanted to sell some way, he would haul them to Sioux Falls for them.
Sure.
That was their general place to sell them.
Yep. And we're talking like a 16-foot straight truck.
Right.
Yep. With a flatbed that you'd put a box on to haul the cattle in.
It had
livestock.
Had high sides so you could haul cattle.
Right. And
also had what we called a double deck in it. If we wanted to haul sheep, you could put sheep on top of the deck and underneath.
Yep.
And same way with pigs.
So go ahead.
My dad passed away in 1948. And so at that time I thought it was pretty neat just to keep that business going. So I took over the business of hauling the livestock and whatever else for the neighbors and one thing and another.
Sure.
Which was one of the wrong. I should never have done that. I never made any money doing that. I just broke even, I think.
Yeah. And you would have been 20 at that time, is that right?
Well, I probably, pretty close.
Same truck hauling grain then too?
You're right.
Yep. And just the one truck?
Yes.
Yep. The grain you were hauling, we talked about, was probably wheat. Is that right?
Wheat or corn.
Yeah. And same thing hauling for the neighbors too?
Yeah. In later years, my brother bought a corn sheller that mounted on a truck, and he shelled corn for everybody around the neighborhood. And then it got to be where we had government that was buying some corn, and they had bins around the different spots in the neighborhood. And so then when he was shelling corn, there wasn't a lot of neighbors that had trucks, so I got in on hauling corn for that he shelled to some of those bin sites, also to some of the elevators in town.
Sure. And what was the government doing with the corn when they were buying it at that time?
They eventually sold it, but they figured by taking it off the market, I guess they raised the price. I don't know.
Yep. It was around that time when they really started to push it to cattle. It hadn't always been a cattle feed, had it? I mean,
no, not always, I guess.
Yeah. So I feel like that was somewhere in that neighborhood of post-World War II, maybe.
My dad used to fill silo for people and the neighbors, and we had what they called a stationary cutter. You had to cut the corn in bundles, and then load them on a rack and haul them up and throw them in a conveyor that went into where they got chopped up and blowed in the silo.
Yeah, and it was was it separating corn chaff from kernels, or
no? All together.
The whole thing was going. The whole plant.
Yep.
Wow. Huh. What about, was the livestock, or did you say you guys had sheep too?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So were they out on the fields, on the farm fields in the wintertime, or in the?
Yes, a lot of times they were. We generally didn't buy the lambs. Most of the lambs came from West River. They came on the train. The first couple of years that I remember. And then we'd unload them in Brookings. And 2 of the years, we drove them on the road from Brookings out here to the farm.
Wow. And
then my dad made sheep bunks, just little A-frame bunks. And generally, we ground a lot of feed, a lot of corn and oats and stuff to feed them sheep. And then turned them out in the cornfield to clean up what the corn picker missed and stuff like that.
Yeah. And so, I'm sorry, I always say I'm row crop illiterate, but the corn picker was taking the whole plant? Is that right?
Just the ears.
Just the ears, right. Okay. That's what it was. So then you were talking about talking about throwing the whole plant, though, into the deal that shot it into the bin, right?
Right.
Would it come out of that as silage then?
Yes.
Okay, so it was fermenting in there.
At that time, there was a lot of people that just didn't have an upright silo, what we call a cement stave. And a lot of times they would take a bunch of corn cribbing, which is slatted, and fill that full for a pile on the ground. But most generally, people started putting up silos and cement stave silos, and we'd fill them, put a big pipe up, and most of them were running about 40 foot tall.
And then where did it go from there? How did it come out, and where did it go? How did it get fed?
Go right down into the silo.
Right.
And then when we wanted to feed the cattle that silage, why, then you crawled up what they called a chute, where all the doors were. One side of the silo had doors the full length of it. About every 3 feet there was a door. And so you go up with a fork and maybe a pickaxe in the wintertime because the silage would freeze. And you didn't want it to build up along the walls of the silo because it might fall down and kill you. So we'd throw the silage down, and then when it got down on what you thought you had enough in a pile down below, then you took a 2-bushel basket and you carried it out to the feed bunks, which generally were close by, and you dump it in the feed bunk for the cattle. So
the boys were the mixer wagon back in that day.
There was no mixer wagon.
You were it.
Yeah.
Yeah, with your bushel basket, 2-bushel basket. So you said that you would, so the doors went up the side of the silo, and then you'd climb inside and throw it down. Was there a chute at the bottom?
A chute all along in front of those doors.
Okay, so you were throwing it out those doors, and
yeah,
I see. Yep, gotcha. But you were inside the silo,
yeah,
and making sure that it didn't build up on the walls so it wouldn't fall.
Yeah. when it was real cold in the winter, like 20 below, then the silage would freeze next to the wall.
Right. And you had to have the pickaxe to get it. Huh. Yeah. So then are there any years that stand out? You mentioned the dust in I think you said 31 and 32 were the dry years, is that right?
Right.
Were there any other years that stand out as far as weather is concerned, whether it's winter storms or wet years or?
Well, I don't know for sure which years were considered wet. Probably in 37, 38, along in there, things started looking up, and that's when we started. My dad started buying a tractor or two, Ellis Chalmers tractor with rubber tires, which was unheard of, and we generally sowed the oats in the spring with a in-gate seeder and a team of horses, and when almost had to have 4 horses to pull the wagon through all the mud a couple of the years, back in probably 37, 38.
Sure. And you said end-gate seeder?
Yeah.
Can you tell me how that worked? I don't.
Well, you put the seed in the box,
Mm-hmm.
and then you had what they call the end gate seeder that you fastened to the back end of the box, and it had fans underneath. There are 2 fans, and then a hopper. You scoop the oats in the hopper, and a chain on the wheel of the wagon that would drive the seeder.
Mm-hmm.
And then you drove you guessed about how wide you're throwing the oats. And when you came back, you'd move over where you thought was right width and make another pass back.
So it was broadcast
Yes.
planning, basically.
Yes.
I see. Okay.
And a lot of times after you seeded before the oats came up, we had what they called a drag. And you'd take and hook the horses to the drag and drag the oats so that it got in the soil a little better, and also so that it was smoother for harvest.
Sure. Yep. You mentioned that the sheep came from West River on a train, and so you guys didn't lamb anything out, didn't have any ewes. It was
My dad had a small flock of ewes.
okay.
Maybe 40, 50 head,
Okay.
and we'd raised lambs from them.
Right. And then he was buying some extras to
Right.
to feed, and they went to Sioux Falls as well.
Yep.
Gotcha. And you talked about them coming in on the train. They came to Brookings on the train.
Yes.
And then you also talked about driving them here, and that was just kind of a few of you on foot.
Yep.
Yep. Walking them
Yeah. Walk behind them.
9 miles.
Get them to go the right place, not go where they weren't supposed to.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. And that would have been you and your dad, your brother, and the hired men?
Yes.
Hired man or hired men?
Yeah.
The 4 or 5 of you that took to get them here? Yeah. That's interesting. And how was that purchase made? Do you know? Did your dad know somebody West River that he bought them from directly, or did he have a buyer out there buy them for him? Or
I guess he had somebody I think it was somebody from here that kind of specialized in doing that. I think a guy lived in Flandreau at that time, and I think that's who he went through to pay to get those sheep.
sure. Do you have any idea where they came from?
Okay, just all I know is out
From West River.
round Faith out in that
Oh,
country.
yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, my dad has said for a long time that there wasn't a. My dad always said there isn't a ranch north or west of Belle Fourche that wasn't paid for with sheep. And then I moved northeast of Belle Fourche, and I figured out those ranches were all paid for with sheep too. So it was the coyotes have chased a lot of people out. I think partly and then they're more labor intensive than a cow, and so I think when the kids leave, a lot of times the sheep leave behind them. So,
well, the sheep will lead if you get one to go.
right.
Otherwise, if you have to drag one out and the rest don't follow, you're in trouble. You got to drag the next one out.
Yep, that's for sure. And so they came in on the train. Where is that depot still there in Brookings, or is it
It's no longer there.
no longer there?
No, there's a bulk gas delivery station there now.
Okay. And is the track still running through, but in a different place, or is
Yeah.
it? Yep. Gotcha. Yep. Huh. That's interesting. What about any other winters or winter storms that stand out in your mind as far as?
Well, the road that goes by this farm used to be what they called a township road, and there was trees on both sides of it, and a lot of them were ash trees, big trees. And until I was married, the road was the same thing. But then the powers to be decided they were going to put a new road in there, and they took all the trees out and piled them or drug them next to the fence, next to the road, the new road. But before that, the snow was almost impossible to keep clean on those roads because of all the trees.
Sure.
And my cousin, who lived just a quarter of a mile from here, we both had the same kind of tractors. We had International M tractors with loaders on them. And we made a V-plow to put on one of the loaders. And then the other loader, we put a deal to hook up to the drawbar of the first one. So we had one pushing the other one. And when the roads got plugged, then we would go out and try and plow them out with that snow plow that we made. Well, it was all right till the snow got too deep and too heavy and too hard. But we had to do a lot of welding and a lot of fixing a lot of times. But it was quite a thing compared to what we were using before.
Yeah. You talked about your dad bringing home an Alice Chalmers tractor with rubber tires. Do you remember, were all tractors back then classified by the number of bottoms they would pull? Is that how they were all numbered, or is that just
Yes, they were.
So do you remember how many?
Two bottom plow.
Okay, so it was a
two bottom tractor plow.
Gotcha. Yeah. And that's it. Did it replace the horses at that time, or did they?
Well, eventually it did.
Right.
But it took a little while to get. Getting back to the horses, my dad used to break horses. And he had a horse-drawn plow, of course, and he'd put 2 horses or 3, and then the horse that was green that didn't know what to do, he would put on the outside that he had to walk in the soft dirt. And that way it was more work for him, and he didn't try to run away or anything. Yeah. I seen my dad even put what they called I don't know what they called it, but put a strap on his hind leg, one of them, on his hoof, and the rope back to where he was sitting on the plow. And if the horse got too foxy, well, he'd jerk on that rope and try and trip the horse.
And breaking horses to drive, or were there any of them ridden? Did any of them get ridden?
Not those horses.
Yeah.
My brother had a pony that he rode. It was really a foxy one. Whenever a lot of times he would take me to school, grade school, whenever the roads were plugged that I couldn't, or weather was too snowy to walk. A lot of times he'd just I'd jump on behind him and away to school we'd go.
Yeah. Yeah. Your dad, you said, came to America in 1913?
Yes.
He would have been an adult then?
Yes.
And it was his, did he come alone?
Well, he had different, he had quite a few siblings that were with him. I had 3 or 4 aunts that lived in this part of the country, and he had a brother who used to come up here that lived in Iowa at that time, but he used to come up here and help now and then.
Sure. And did he grow up on a farm in it's be modern day Denmark? Is that right? Or,
I don't really know.
Okay. You don't know if he grew up on a farm or did?
I don't know.
Okay, gotcha. It would be modern day Denmark, though, right? Is that?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, gotcha. You took over at about 20 years old. Is kind of what we were saying. And was that you had the M tractor by then or before then?
I had it by then.
Yep. And yeah, just walk me through some of your early years of farming. All tractor work by then?
Yes.
Horses were they gone?
Well, pretty much.
Yeah. And did you learn to drive the team? I mean, you knew how to drive the teams and everything.
Oh yeah.
Growing up, but did you continue to break some horses?
No, I did not.
So, did your dad or did your brother or how was the horse population maintained? Is what I guess I'm trying to ask.
Well, it just kind of they got sold off to people who wanted a team of horses or whatever, and they eventually got sold off.
Sure. And so then, did you have multiple tractors by you? I think you said 1948. Did you have multiple tractors here, some with loaders, some without, and doing some of that work, or?
Probably not until 1950 or later.
I see. Before you had multiple tractors here.
Yeah.
But it was one tractor doing all the work.
Right.
And then were you pulling a harvester or a picker with that tractor by that time, or?
Yes. Yes, to some extent.
Yep. Early on, was it picked by hand? Was the corn picked by hand, or?
Yes, it was.
And a horse pulling a cart, throw it in the cart, or how?
The horse was pulling a three box wagon, and it would hold about 100 bushels of ear corn. And generally, my dad had a 1 or 2 people that would come and work just during that part of the season to pick corn, besides our own help that we had. There generally was about 3 wagons out in the field at one time picking corn.
And any of them neighbors, or were they all yours?
No. Sometimes there was a neighbor that came and helped.
And then would you go and help them pick their corn after? Or
I don't think so.
Okay. Gotcha. Darren, you've been sitting here listening. Have we missed anything major? Got some notes, I see.
Yeah. I remember the kids. Grandpa took my kids out picking rock one day, and he told them about being drafted.
Okay.
And I hadn't ever heard that story before, but...
Would that have been in World War II or Korea?
Korea.
Gotcha. And did you get deployed into Korea then?
No, that was shortly after my dad passed away.
Okay.
In the same year or the next year, I don't remember which. But I got called to, at that time, Sioux Falls was the place to go to get checked up to see if you were eligible to go to be drafted.
Right.
And so I went with a busload of guys to Sioux Falls and went through the rigmarole and came back. Then I had to go meet with the draft board in Brookings. And the head guy at the draft board said, well, he says, you don't have to go serve in the Army, because your mother doesn't have anybody to run your farm.
Mm-hmm.
You're the only one left to run the farm, so we're going to defer you from going to the draft. But some of my neighbors that went along, they were drafted.
Sure. And you didn't have to do any kind of service in place
No,
of
I
going
didn't.
or anything?
No.
Gotcha. And did your brother continue to farm in the neighborhood, or
Yeah.
he had his own place?
He had his own place.
Gotcha. And
We basically worked together, though.
Mm-hmm. It was close.
Yeah.
Gotcha. A neighboring quarter, or
Yeah, just a mile away.
I see.
There's one thing that we missed too, and that was when Grandpa quit school. It's pretty interesting. The choice your dad gave you, either to continue on school or to quit.
What age was that?
Well, when I graduated from 8th grade in school, he said, you can either go to high school or you can work on the farm. So I said, I'll work on the farm. I'm smart.
And then he bought you a tractor to work on the farm, right?
Yes, he did. He bought an Alice Chalmers tractor. It was a smaller one that I could handle, and I cultivated corn, and I did this and that, and most anything.
And you would have been 14 or 15 at that time, is that right?
Yeah.
And so this would have been in 43 or something like that,
Yeah.
42, 43. Gotcha. That was my question I was coming back to is, can you tell me about the neighborhood life? What was life in the neighborhood like? Was there a lot of people around, a lot of community events or gatherings at the community hall or church and some of those things?
Well, there was some. We went to church in Aurora, the Methodist Church in Aurora. And we didn't go until my siblings were able to drive a car, I think. And my mother would go. My dad never went to church. He was too busy. And
Where's Aurora? I'm sorry, where's that from here?
it's about 7 miles from here,
East?
east and north.
East.
It's about straight east of Brookings.
Okay, gotcha. And any neighborhood gatherings or community gatherings, picnics, or
Used to have some neighborhood picnics, but that was almost before my time.
okay, gotcha. Don't remember to going to many neighborhood
No.
functions or anything
No,
like that. Neighbors coming over in the evenings, or kind of private, kept to yourselves, or do you remember?
oh, used to be some neighbors come over in the evening and visit. Maybe they'd play cards or maybe not.
Sure. Yep. And just have supper together and enjoy the neighbors,
Yep.
kind of. What are some of your memories about your years of farming on your own? Some of the advancements. I mean, you've witnessed a lot. I think you were talking about a 2-bottom tractor that you got probably, right, in 8th grade.
Yeah.
And now you probably actively farmed into the, through a lot of transition. You've seen a lot of change in farming over the years.
Well, when my dad died, then of course there was an estate settlement, and I don't remember how much land he owned at that time, but that was divided up between my 2 sisters and my brother, and I ended up with a place here where I was born, but I had to pay some of my siblings in order to even up the amount of money it took to settle the estate.
So then it was an equal share split
Yes.
between the 4 of you.
Yeah. And then later on, after a couple of years, I started buying some of my siblings' land that they had inherited. And so then had expansion of land, and needed more tractors and more help, and one thing led to another. When I first year I was married, I had a single employee working here, and he lived with us in the house. And so my new wife, or not new anyhow, she had to cook for the single employee that we had, and that was, as I think back, that was quite an event to expect a 19-year-old girl to step in and start cooking for everybody and things like that. But she really handled the challenge very well. And then, of course, that added more people to the family. My first son was born about, Darryl, a year later, a little over a year.
Yeah, he was born in 53.
53, we were married in 52. So, and then Darren was born a year later than that.
Greg,
I mean.
Your dad?
My dad was the first one.
Oh, okay.
Greg is number 2.
Gotcha.
There got to be more wheels. You didn't use horses anymore.
Continued with the dairy, and you said you quit the dairy, or when, or what time did you stop milking cows?
I quit milking just before I got married.
So you would have been in your early 20s when you got married? Is that right? Yeah. And what did you bring in to replace the milk cows?
Well, I think we just bought more cattle to feed and fatten.
I see.
And then had bigger, more acres of crop, things like that. And
continued rotation of crops and selling wheat and feeding the corn to the cattle.
Yeah, we didn't grow wheat for very many more years. We kind of quit that, and it was mostly corn, and then soybeans started coming into the picture, and so we had soybeans and corn, and always had a patch of alfalfa to cut to feed the cattle, and
that was put up in square bales.
Yeah, at that time it was. That was before round bales were invented.
Right. Do you remember any loose stacks? Did you ever put up any loose stacks?
No. But I remember when what we called the dirty 30s, we had Russian thistles. That's the only thing that grew. And they were like tumbleweeds. I mean, they just, once the wind got hold of them, they went and filled the fences up. But my dad stacked Russian thistles. I remember seeing at least 2 stacks where they would mow the thistles, push them up in a pile, and make a stack out of them. And he would stack them with a fork. He'd get up on the stack and push them around so that it kind of builds a square mound. But I remember him coming in from stacking one day, and his legs were all bloody. And that was because the thistles were so scratchy.
Yeah.
They scratched his legs.
Wow.
After that, he put gunny sacks. So he tied one on each leg with a twine string. And then he'd get up in the stack, and why or how them cows ever survived on those things, I'll never know.
Yeah. I think there's probably some good nutrients in there, but it's hard to imagine something enjoying eating it.
I remember as a kid going with him in the fall of the year. The wind had blown all the thistles up in the fence line along the roads and stuff, and then they would hold the snow when it snowed and close the road more. And we'd take a 5-gallon or 10-gallon cream can full of water, and then I would have a smaller thing, and he would light a fire to the thistles, but the fence posts were all wooden. And, of course, they would burn up if it didn't. So I'd come along behind him with a scoop of water and try and put out the fire that was on the fence posts before it burned them up.
Huh. And so those were just the thistle that was blown into the fence, he was just burning that out of it.
Yeah.
Gotcha. You were buying beef calves to feed? Were they weaned when you got them back around?
Not always, no.
You know, sometimes come in balling and get them straightened out. And
most generally they weren't weaned.
Okay. And take them to finish?
Yeah.
And where were they coming from?
They were coming from local neighbors around.
Okay.
But years later on, probably in the early 50s, I started going out to Faith and buying cattle.
Okay.
Calves.
And would you haul those back on that same straight truck, or were
No. We hired people with semis.
Had a semi by then?
I had a neighbor that did the same thing of feeding cattle, and we would buy cattle, go out on the ranchers out by Faith and look at their cattle and agree to a price, and then we'd haul them into Faith, and they would weigh them there and sort them so that we got an even bunch of calves.
Sure. Do you remember any of the names of the people you were buying cattle from back then?
I can't remember the names.
Yeah.
If you would say them, I probably would know them. But
Sure. Yeah. And I've only been in that neighborhood for just a couple of years. I've heard some of the names for a long time, but I've only been in that neighborhood for just a few years, so I don't even know all, and especially being as far from Faith as I am now, I don't even know them all. But yeah. So, and they were going to Sioux Falls from there?
No,
when you finished them here?
When I finished them, they would.
They'd go to Sioux Falls and same kind of...
Not necessarily Sioux Falls.
Okay.
Because then we were selling direct to the packing house.
Okay.
And some would go to Sioux Falls stockyards. But some would go like to Tyson. Some would go to Morale. Some would go someplace else.
Was there a Tyson plant in Sioux Falls at that time, or?
Tyson is in Nebraska.
Okay.
Not right close to Sioux City.
Right. Sure. And would the guy from the plant come to your place to look at the cattle and make a deal on them?
They had a buyer that would come.
Yeah. And he'd travel around to different places and put loads together.
Yeah.
And was it a whole load from here at a time, or?
Most generally.
Gotcha. Yep. And has that been kind of the way things have been done here?
Yep.
Since then? Still kind of that way?
Not that way now, but just 2 years ago that we decided to background calves instead of fatten them.
I see. And so they're going to a finishing yard somewhere else?
Go to a sale barn.
Right. Okay. You guys sell them through the sale barn. Were there more sale barns around when you were younger, or has it always been kind of what it is now?
No, there was more. Brookings had a sale barn. Mm-hmm. Coleman had a sale barn. There were several sale barns.
Where do they go now?
Now they go to one by Sioux Falls.
Okay.
It's not in Sioux Falls anymore, but when we have a sale barn in Madison that we patronize.
Gotcha.
A lot of our cull cows go to Madison.
Darren, what do you think? Anything else major?
Yeah, just when he started feeding cattle, he put up the silos so he could mechanize everything. And then he went from feeding from the silos to doing the feed wagon later on.
And that was in the 50s?
When did you build the silos? Probably in the 50s?
Started in the 50s.
Up till that point, it was still a 2-bushel basket feeding?
Yep.
You and your boys and did you have some hired men still?
One.
Yep. And you all were getting that done every day? Yep. And then what was the early mechanization of the feeding process? What did that involve? What were you using to feed them mechanically?
Well, for the first things we did was made a cement bunk that we could put an auger down the middle of it. We bought the auger was in 10-foot lengths. Then you had a stand at the end of every 10-foot length to support the auger. Then you had to have an electric motor to run the motor or run the gearbox that would. Then you had put the feed down in front of the bunk, and it would auger it clear to the other end. That's how we kind of got started. And then later on, we started using a feed wagon of sort to build another yard, and had 2 yards for with that augers and stuff for then feed wagon. Then we built all the pens on. We have 5 pens out a ways away from the buildings now that we feed cattle with. And those, you have to have a feed wagon to fill the bunk.
Sure. Gotcha. Any of that still in operation? Some of the old?
None of the old stuff.
Gotcha.
I remember using the auger bunks just very little when I was younger. I remember going to watch Grandpa doing chores with my uncle, and they would be running corn out of one silo and silage out of another silo into that auger, trough and auger, and then one reason why I remember it is because I thought it would be neat to stick my foot in it, and I started to, and I was snatched up by an uncle pretty quick.
Yeah. Was that a common practice? Was that the common way of doing it, the auger in the bunk? Was that how people in the neighborhood did it?
There were several of them that were trying that, but it wasn't long until feed wagons came into play, and that was pretty much the end result.
Sure. And that was, the feed wagons were a safer way to do it, would you say, or what was the attraction of doing it that way?
Well, you could feed more cattle.
I suppose you didn't have to have the bunk, the auger in every bunk, and yeah, sure, gotcha. Anything you were hoping to share? Any pieces of history you feel like I've missed, or things that, I mean, we've covered a long time period here, just in an hour. But I mean, anything that you felt like could.
Back to the school days when I walked to school, the snow was deep. We used to have telephone lines in the ditch of the school road. I mean, and I used to walk to school and just reach up and hang on to the telephone wire. The snow was that deep.
Oh wow. Oh, yeah, that's a.
There was many days when we had blizzards that you could not see to go anywhere.
Right.
At one time, one year, my dad, we had a severe storm, and he took a rope and tied it to the barn and led up to the house, and used the rope as a guide to know how to get from the barn to the house. Yeah,
and I guess back in those days when the snow came, there was no real good way to move it, so you just kind of would work around it.
Generally, there was 3-day blizzard was pretty popular back when I was a youngster.
Yeah. So a lot of the guys I've talked to in my neighborhood talk about the blizzard of '49. Do you remember? Did that come this far east, or do you remember that specifically?
I don't remember it specifically.
Gotcha. It might not have come this far east, dude. They were the last people I talked to said that they forecasted a dusting of snow, and it was in January, I think, and it was really cold. It ended up being really cold, windy, and long 3-day blizzard kind of a thing. So,
yeah.
Were you guys surprised by weather much, or did you kind of know it was coming when it was coming, or?
Well, we were pretty much aware of the possibility of it coming.
In a radio? Is that how you would hear about it, or?
Yeah, radios were kind of scarce at that time.
Right. So the ones I was talking to said that they would only plug in the radio in the evening, kind of to listen to the weather and the news or whatever. Did you have electricity and all that?
Yes, we had electricity. That's another thing that I would like to relay is that after this house was built, I don't know how many years later, but my dad purchased a generator, and we had batteries, and they were 32 volt, and they were in the basement of the house, and the generator run with a gas engine.
Okay.
And I still remember the smell of the gas engine whenever we had to run it in order to charge up the batteries. But we had 32 volt light bulbs, and they were popular all the time that I was in grade school, pretty much.
But there wasn't refrigeration or anything. It was just to run, those batteries were just to run the light bulbs, pretty much?
Pretty much.
Yeah. And then refrigeration was an ice box?
Right.
Is that right? And then they would, was it stored, did each farm store their own ice, or did you go to a public place to get ice and bring it back to the...
No, we had a guy that delivered ice.
Okay.
Went around the country just like they deliver other stuff.
Right. Yep.
It wasn't UPS, but...
Was there milk delivery back then, or you guys had your own milk because you were milking cows, or?
There was milk delivery some places, but we never did.
Right. And then the milk that you guys were taking to Brookings probably would have been delivered, milk that was delivered to somebody else.
Somebody else, yeah.
Yeah. And you talk about separating it, so then the milk that you took in, was it skim milk then, or?
Some of it was. We also had cream.
Right. And when you separate the
Yeah.
cream, you end up with skim milk, don't you?
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I've enjoyed this very much. I don't know if I'm missing anything major, but I appreciate your time very much. So.
Well, I thank you.
Darren?
Yeah,
Anything else?
not that I know of, unless he wants to touch on how they heated the house.
Yeah.
Well, we heated it with a furnace in the basement, and we cut every fall. Had to gather up all the crew that was around to saw down trees, ash trees, and generally went down to, we have a river bottom pasture, we call it. Sioux River goes through it, and go down and cut wood for a couple of days and throw it in the truck and haul it home and throw it in the... They had a separate room in the basement just for wood. And we didn't start buying coal till I was a teenager, at least. But the reason they started buying coal was when they just burned wood on the real cold nights, somebody had to get up and put more wood in the furnace to keep it warm.
The coal would burn longer then?
Yeah.
Yeah. And was there a chute from the outside that you'd throw the wood or the coal into?
Just a window. Just
okay.
a window. Throw it through the window.
So it would have to be, it was all split and ready to go in before you ever brought it in?
Well, not necessarily all split.
Okay.
A lot of it was.
Gotcha.
That was another job I had to do when I got home from school, was split wood, and had to go out in the pig pen and pick up cobs to burn in the cook stove. Whether there was half covered with manure or not, or snow, you kind of knock off what you could and have a basket full sitting in the house by the stove so my mother could use it to start the stove and heat it for breakfast and dinner.
And it was a, would it have been called a corncob stove then, or what? Would you burn other things in it, or?
I don't think we ever did burn anything else than cobs in it. It wasn't a very big place to put stuff in.
Sure. And was there an oven and a cooktop in that?
Yes.
In that, and did your mom cook 3 meals a day on that?
Yep. We had potatoes and some form of meat or eggs 3 times a day.
And pork quite often, and
yeah.
And how was that kept? How did?
Well, it's kept in a barrel that they use salt to preserve it.
Yep. Like a crock, right? Would it
Yeah.
have been a stone crock?
Yeah.
And then I talked to one lady one time. Actually, what kind of inspired me to start doing this was she told me about her mom had a stone crock, and she would render the lard, and it would be a layer of sausage, and then a layer of lard, and then a layer of something else. And was it? Do you remember it being like that?
Oh, yeah. My mother didn't layer it like that, but they rendered the lard, and it seemed like she put it in little cans and whatever. And I don't remember whether it was stored outside for a while or what. But
Used
I know,
for cooking?
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Delicious. Lard, potatoes and meat cooked in lard. I mean, that's good eating.
The boiled potatoes that we had for dinner, lunch, and noon lunch. Then she cut them up and then fried it for supper, lunch.
Okay.
And breakfast was, of course, eggs and toast, and seemed like we always had potatoes there too.
Sure. And did you keep any of the wheat to make into flour for the toast to make the bread? Or
No, we did not.
bought the flour in town, but probably
Oh, she was baking bread every week.
right. And a couple of times a year you would buy flour. It wouldn't be every Saturday.
Yeah.
Right. Gotcha. Yeah. This is really good. I really enjoy it. Go ahead.
Was one of my kids had asked about water, and so I was wondering if you could explain how we got water in the house before rural water.
Well, there was a cistern underneath the one room in the house, and we had eaves troughs that collected all the water, went in that cistern. Then we had a charcoal area in the cistern where the water would go through that charcoal, and supposedly would purify it, because we never did anything else to purify it.
Wow. And so would it be come out of there by bucket? A bucket at a time?
No, we
or-
had a little hand pump.
Okay, gotcha. Yep. A hand pump pulling it through that charcoal filter, basically, right?
Yeah,
And then into a bucket
yeah.
out of the hand pump, and then used it for bathing, washing clothes, cooking, all that, drinking.
Whole 9 yards.
And how big was that cistern?
Well, it was pretty good size. I don't know. It was probably,
I think it's pretty close to 16 or 18 feet deep. It's pretty deep.
Still there? Huh. Wow. And what's it made out of?
cement.
Cement. And that would have been cement that was mixed and poured in before the house was built over
Yeah.
top of it.
Yeah,
And this was in the basement?
yeah.
Huh. Wow. That's cool. Was there a basin then that the dishes were done in and all that?
Yeah.
And clothes separate in a different place, washed in a different place, or
Yeah, a little bit.
yeah, wrung them out, hung them on the line, or how were they dried in the winter? Just wear the same clothes all winter?
Yeah, they're put out on the line when it was fit.
When it was,
Otherwise, they were hung on throughout the house on a string of some kind.
right, in the wood heat or whatever would
Yeah.
dry them out. Man, that's neat. Yeah. Good.
That's about it. Yeah.
Okay.
The stories Grandpa's always told, and other people I've heard tell stories, the people his generation and older were just tough folks. And
Yes.
it's amazing what they went through to make it easy for us these days.
Yeah. Well, I very much appreciate the time, and it was great. I really, really enjoyed it. So, thank you.
It doesn't matter whether you're on the backfield or the front yard. On Mow Day, perfection is a game of inches. It's a battle of fence line and fierce terrain. Out there, on that grasshopper mower, you don't let anything stop your stripes. Nothing stands in the way of a job well done. For more on mow day and grasshopper mowers, visit grasshoppermower.com.
Very good stuff there. Really, really appreciate that opportunity, and really excited about this. Heard from some people who have taken the opportunity after hearing these episodes to gather up some equipment and go out and do the same thing with people they're aware of in their neighborhoods, and I'm really excited about that impulse being awakened and people getting out and doing those things. So keep up that good work, and hopefully we'll see some of that get shared publicly and just continue to capture some of this history. Very much appreciate that. Next week on the Working Cows podcast, really looking forward to sharing with you an interview I did with Ken Redmond. Ken is the son of Carney Redmond. Maybe those names don't sound familiar to some of you, maybe they do to others, but really what this episode is about linear measuring. Now, linear measuring is the tool behind what we've talked with Steve Campbell about. We've talked to Steve about the Red Solo Cup cow and about bull sale catalog wish lists and what we want for these reasons. And so Ken and I are going to dive into an in-depth discussion about ratios and why this works better than that as far as this width or this circumference compared to that length and some of those things. And really good conversation with Ken. I'm looking forward to sharing with you real soon for another episode of the Working Cows podcast.
We invite you to visit workingcows.net to subscribe to the show via iTunes or Stitcher. You'll also find detailed show notes pages, resources from our guests, and the industry leaders who have influenced them. For more ideas on putting your cows to work for you in a more profitable way, tune in next week.